Greetings and welcome to the Plsql channel, a series of video trainings in the Oracle Plsql language. My name is Stephen Feuerstein, and I'm a Plsql developer just like you. This lesson is part of my series on writing dynamic SQL inside the Plsql language, and the topic of this lesson is executing queries dynamically with Method 3 Dynamic SQL. Some quick reminders. You can access all the code that I'll be running in my lesson, this and other lessons, at toadworld.com/sf, otherwise known as Plsql Obsession. There are lots of resources there for Plsql developers, so you can access all of my code in the demo zip, and also PowerPoint documents that support my trainings. Second, make sure that you're already comfortable with the material that I've covered in previous lessons in the series on Dynamic SQL, Introduction and Overview, in which I talk about the 4 different methods of Dynamic SQL, executing DDL and DML statements, methods 1 and 2, and in particular in methods 2, I talk about bind variables and placeholders. So if these concepts and ideas, terminology is not familiar to you, the different methods of Dynamic SQL, bind variables and placeholders, please watch those videos first. What I'm going to be talking about now is method 3 Dynamic SQL, when I'm executing a query dynamically, and it has a fixed number of elements in the select list. In other words, at the time I compile my code, I know the number of expressions that will be on the select list of the query. I might have selecting last name and salary. I might be selecting all the elements in all the columns in my table, but I know the number at the time of compilation. So I can basically say execute immediate my string, and I can fetch into, just like select into, I can execute immediate into my list of variables, and I can also use the using clause to specify one or more bind variables. If you do not know the number of elements at the time you're writing your code, in other words, I don't know if I'm selecting 2 or 5 or 25, I won't know until the user requests execution of my code. Then you're talking about a method 4 Dynamic SQL implementation. It's much more complex, and you will need to use DBMS SQL. But if you know the number of elements that you're selecting, then you can query a single row or multiple rows of data pretty easily with execute immediate and the open for clause that I'll show you soon, basically using the into clause to retrieve the data back into a set of Plsql variables. And those variables could be individual lists of variables like salary, comma, name, comma, ID. It could be a record structure. It could even be fetching into a collection, populating multiple rows of data. So what we'll do is take a look at individual row querying and then multi-row querying. So retrieving a single row dynamically. It's the simplest form of method 3. Your query identifies a single row of data. The into clause of execute immediate directs the expressions from the select list into the list of variables, or as I've mentioned, you can even fetch into a record. Let's take a look at a number of examples. First of all, my tab count program. Let's close all this stuff down. So tab count. Rather than writing select count star over and over again, I've decided to write a single function called table count that takes the name of the owner of the table, the name of the table, and an optional where clause, and it returns the number of rows in the table. So inside my program, I say execute immediate. I construct my select statement, select count star, and you know that will always return one row at most, and in fact always one row, from owner.table, and then I'll add the where clause. If the where clause is not null, then I'll put in where and the where clause, otherwise nothing. I grab the value back through the into clause and then return it. Now there's a lot of other stuff inside this program I won't be talking about until I talk about best practices for dynamic SQL, and specifically avoiding the danger of SQL injection. So that's what all of this stuff is about. So we won't get into that right now. The main thing is execute immediate, construct your select statement. The into clause has to have a matching number of elements in it for the number of elements selected in the list, in the query, and then I can return, in this case, just that one value. So I'm going to compile this program, and then I'll run it to get the total number of rows in the employees table, the total number of rows in department ID 50, and the total number of rows in the departments table. Run my code, and here's my output. 107 employees, 45 in department 50, 27 departments in my company. So a single row query, In this case, always retrieving that one row, and I return the value, a single value being returned. Let's take a look at next key. Now with next key, what I'm going to show you here is how you can hide the retrieval of the next value from a sequence. Oftentimes, at least prior to Oracle 11, if I need to get the value from the sequence, I would write select, begin, select, oh my gosh, it's hard to type, isn't it? Select dyn sequence, next val, into my next key from usually sys.dual. So this would be the traditional and very much non-optimal way to do this. So let's just finish it up here. The problem with this code is I'm exposing how I'm getting my sequence with my select from dual, which is a pretty kludgy operation, and of course I have to write this over and over again. So what I could do is create a single program called next key, pass in the name of the sequence, I create the select statement on the fly, get the next value from dual, fetch it into my single value and return it. And in Oracle 11.2, I can even do a direct assignment. So in 11.2, I no longer have to do a select from dual. I could do something like this. The next key is assign the value of dyn sequence.nextVal. And I can do that dynamically as well. This is an example, by the way, of dynamic Plsql. But in any case, all these variations will work. And if you're not on Oracle 11 yet, you certainly can't take advantage of this syntax. You'd have to write your select from dual. And instead of doing that, you could hide the implementation and simply say, get me the next key for that sequence. I run this code, and I see that it gets me all the values for the sequence. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In other words, it used up 1 right here, then it got 2 and 3, it used up 4 here, and then it got 5 and 6. So again, single row dynamic query, in this case simply hiding the underlying mechanics of how I get my next value from my sequence. And then let's look at the other examples. Method 3 example script. So first of all, what I'm going to do is fetch multiple columns from the employees table, 2 columns, for a given primary key, and I'm going to drop them into my local variables. And I'm not sure why I did this, but notice I've got a record structure here. So if I want to, I can say record.field, an individual variable. It doesn't matter as long as the data type of this thing is compatible with the data type of the element being selected. Let's try that. Run my code, and I see that styles is the last name for employee ID 138. So it retrieved that 1 row for me, populated my variables, and then I can work with the data. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to bind in my value. So just to make sure you know, even though I'm doing selects, I can also bind values in with the using clause. So rather than hard coding 138, I'm going to provide a placeholder, colon, and then the name of the placeholder. And then I have to match up that placeholder with a value in my using clause. And I run this and get exactly the same result. So you can use both into clause. Into clause is required for selects. The using clause is optional, but is often used as well. Let's take a look at fetching into an entire record. So I don't have to fetch individual values or fetch into individual values. I can say I'm going to declare a record based on the table %row type. Give me all the columns from that table for this primary key, and it gets me that information. No problem. Now, you cannot bind in a record structure. I can't use a record to bind into a dynamic SQL statement, but because it's not an SQL type, this is not an SQL data type, anything in the using list has to be compatible with SQL. So you can't bind in a record structure, but Oracle's more than happy to fetch multiple elements into a record structure as long as the number of elements in their type in the select list match the number of fields and their data type in the record, which makes it a lot easier to fetch multiple columns of data from an underlying table or even a join of multiple tables. Okay, so that's fetching a single row, pretty straightforward. Fetching multiple rows dynamically, this is also supported with dynamic SQL. And you have 2 options. If you need to retrieve more than one row of data, you can use either cursor variables and the open for statement, or execute immediate with bulk collect into. Now, bulk collect is the bulk processing mechanism for retrieving multiple rows very quickly in PL/SQL. If you're not familiar with bulk collect and the collections that you have to use with them, check out my separate lesson series on turbocharging SQL performance in PL/SQL, and also the series on collections. Generally, execute immediate is the preferred method because it's simpler to write, understand, and maintain. But if you are retrieving a large number of rows of data, you'll probably want to use open for, because with that approach, you can limit the number of rows you'll be fetching with each retrieval. Let's take a look. So in my first example, let's pull it out. Clear out my output. I'm going to declare a nested table of employee records. So every element in this collection looks just like a row in the employees table. And then with a single execute immediate statement, I can say construct my select statement. Obviously, this is not a dynamic select statement, so we're assuming there's something about it that is dynamic if you're really using this feature. I can't just say into my collection because I'm retrieving multiple rows, and in fact, if I try to say just into, Oracle says, no way, expression L employees is of the wrong type. So if I use an into, then the elements that are here have to represent a single row of data, a record, or a list of variables. If I'm fetching multiple rows of data, which is certainly what is happening here, then I need to say bulk collect into. In fact, here, let's do this one more time. Let's get rid of the bulk collect. Let's have just one record. And let's look at another kind of error that you get. If I have a single record right here, and I try to fetch into that one record, let's see what happens then. Oracle says, look, I tried to get multiple rows, but you said you wanted a single row. Select into, or execute immediate into, is an exact fetch, one row. And this returns more than the number of rows. So you'll get that kind of mismatch. Instead, what you want to do is employees and bulk collect into. So now I'm saying whatever number of rows that you get, take them and bulk collect them into my list of employees, and then show me the number of rows that I've modified. I run my code, and I see that there are 107 rows. By the way, see the number of rows that I modified. That's not true. I misspoke. See the number of rows that I've queried, the number of rows in my collection. So if I want to fetch multiple rows of data, I certainly can do that with execute immediate, but I need to use bulk collect. If I use bulk collect, I have to specify a collection as the recipient